East Africa's largest economy appears to have more external funding coming its way. Kenya is in talks with the World Bank for a new credit facility. If approval is granted, the World Bank will give Kenya $200 million, about 22.7 billion shillings, to support various development projects in order to improve food security in the country. Vinay Kunar Vutukuru, the senior agriculture economist with the bank, said on Monday that the institution is negotiating with Kenya on the new loan that will be channeled to various agricultural value chains. Talks are expected to conclude within the next 2 months. Now, prior to this, the multilateral lender has been funding many other projects in the country's agricultural sector to the tune of about $500 million, or about 56.8 billion shillings. Today, our focus is on Kenya engaging the World Bank for a $200 million facility. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope Adileru Balogun. My guest is Professor X.N. Iraki, Associate Professor from the University of Nairobi, Faculty of Business and Management Sciences. Professor Iraki, welcome back to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good morning, or it's an afternoon in Kenya.
Yes, good afternoon to you there. Now, let's start with a bit of background. So, the World Bank has offered Kenya a $200 million loan towards various development projects in the agricultural sector. This comes about 3 months after the World Bank gave the East African country about $150 million to address drought. And again, that was also a loan. So let's start with what we've seen has been sort of the monetary relationship between Kenya and the World Bank in the past few years, in the past 1 to 2 years. How much money has been exchanging hands, let's say, between the World Bank and Kenya in recent times?
I don't know I don't have the specific figures in mind. But I do know that in Kenya, the last few years, maybe the last 5 years, debt has been a very big debate, not just from World Bank, but from other lenders like China. So it's a very big debate in the Kenyan economy. And I'm sure as we run up to 2022 polls or general elections, I'm sure that's going to be an issue of the country is getting out of debt externally, and that is having a lot of effect also on the external debt situation. So the bank is not just, the government is not just borrowing externally, but also internally. So that's a big debate in Kenya now.
Okay, so let me help with some of those numbers. Some of the funds granted recently include $1 billion approved in May 2020, $50 million approved in April 2020, $750 million in June 2021, and $150 million in October 2020. Those are just some recent funds. Now, they were given to support the country's economy during COVID, to help with financing shortfalls that came with the budget because of the pandemic, and also to assist Kenya with COVID-19 recovery. When you look at these amounts, they seem like massive amounts of money, and they are targeted at specific areas of the economy. So let's look at that. Are these funds the ones that have been dispersed before? Would you say they've been put to the best use by the Kenyatta administration? Have we seen results?
That's a very hard question. That's a very hard question to answer, because when you invest such a large amount of money, it takes time before you see the effects.
Okay.
For example, if you support agricultural sector, it may take 1 year before you harvest the first crops. It may take another few years before you start exporting the crops, if it is irrigation, if it is improving productivity, and so on. So it's very hard to give a specific answer that money has been put into the right use as far as agriculture is concerned, because it takes time to see the results. And it's not just agriculture, it's in every other sector. It takes time to see the results of policy changes or to see the results of any investment, not just for the government, but also for individuals. But so far, I think the money has been put to good use. Look at the government policies on food security.
So let's talk about some of those policies now. It's been a hard time. We cannot ignore the evidence in front of us. It's been a hard time for Kenya and Kenyans when it comes to food security and, of course, having to deal with the effects of the drought. Also putting in place the invasion by the locusts that the country has also experienced. Now, before the COVID-19 pandemic, Kenya already had a food security issue with 1.3 million people classified as in crisis, emergency, or catastrophe. This number increased by 15% during the pandemic. Do you think this 200 million is sufficient for where Kenya needs to be? It's just the beginning. What do you think about the fund, the number itself, as we look at this conversation?
I don't think that fund is sufficient because if you look at this food insecurity in Kenya, it was not just caused by COVID-19. Even before that, there were other causes of food insecurity. And one of the biggest problems has been drought, that the rain does not come when it is expected. And the second problem has been land fragmentation. One generation subdivides land into smaller pieces, and that becomes very hard to exploit that land productively. It becomes very hard to use machines. So even before COVID came, we had a food situation. And for that reason, I don't think $200 million is sufficient to improve the situation. We need more than that.
Okay, so let's look at the facility. It's targeting Kenya's agricultural sector. The support that's needed, where do you think this money is going to go? How will it be, how should it be dispersed? What are the terms and conditions around it? This is yet another loan, even as you mentioned earlier, that Kenya is in debt as it is right now. And the World Bank happens to be one of the multilateral lenders holding about, I think about 25% of the 30-something percent that is going to multilateral lenders in terms of Kenya's debt. But when you look at the facility and where it's going, what do we know?
If I was to be asked for my opinion where that money should go, it should go to the small-scale farmers. They produce most of the food that is eaten in this country. If you travel across this country from the north to south, from east to west, you find a lot of small-scale farmers using traditional methods of farming, and they are the people who grow the food we eat in the cities, in urban centers. So if I was to improve productivity, I would focus on those small-scale farmers. And one of the best ways to improve their farming is to bring more technology, more appropriate technology, so that people don't use hoes, people don't use stakes to do the farming. They use more appropriate technology. That is not just the use of machines, but also the use of appropriate fertilizers. Remember, the farms are very small. So the only way to increase productivity is to use modern technology. Use some machines, use the best fertilizers possible, and if possible, use traditional manure that is more long-lasting than fertilizer, which you have to use in every season. So focus on the key producers of food, the small-scale farmers. That will have the highest returns.
And I like that we're going there because let me give you some more numbers. I think numbers are really important in this conversation. Agriculture directly contributes 26% to Kenya's GDP, another 27% through linkages with other sectors, and employs about 40% of the population. Those are the small scale farmers that you're talking about. But it's also good to see that Kenya is not waiting solely on the World Bank. In September 2021, the Uhuru Kenyatta government declared the drought experience in Kenya as a natural disaster and released 2 billion Kenyan shillings, about $18 million, to support those in extreme need of food. You mentioned earlier that the government has been putting in place some policy initiatives to help address this. Take us through a few of those, and particularly the ones you think have been successful, and maybe where government needs to make some amends to truly make sure that the initiatives achieve their aim.
I think one of the most ambitious projects that the government had undertaken in the last few years is trying to move away from rain-fed agriculture. Some land has been set aside for irrigation, particularly on the coastal part of this country. Because Kenya has some big rivers, and the government, as we talk now, is building some big dams around Tana River. And we believe that if we can disengage ourselves from rain-fed agriculture, there will be more food security. If you go further, you discover that Kenya imports some food from Tanzania. We also import some food from Uganda. We also import rice from Pakistan and other countries. So it is very important that we start focusing more on food security, because when COVID came, we found what happens to the supply chain. You can go hungry even when you have the money. So in addition to improving the supply chain and engagement from the rest of the world, we need to improve our productive capacity so that we can always complement what we import with what we produce locally, particularly food crops like maize, that is Kenya's staple. We also need to start moving away from traditional food like maize and diversify, so that we can get millet, we can get other crops that are drought resistant and crops that are easy to store when we have a lot of food that has been harvested. Food like potatoes and so on are very hard to keep. We need to look at food that can be stored, and if we have any surplus, we can store it until it is needed.
And it's interesting when you look at how important Kenya is in this whole conversation. East Africa's largest economy, they were not the only ones affected by droughts, not the only ones affected by the locust invasion. So how critical is it for Kenya to get its agricultural sector right, or at least up and working well, that it can directly and indirectly influence the rest of the region?
If you look at the fact we have stated that agriculture contributes about 26% of the GDP, that's a very high percentage. So if there is any contraction in the agricultural sector, that affects other sectors of the economy. A whole quarter of the GDP is too big. So that's a sector we cannot ignore, because not only does it affect food security, does it affect the stability of the country, but it also has a lot of connection with other sectors of the economy. And any drag on agriculture is a drag on other sectors, including employment, including areas like transport, areas like export trade. So agriculture has a very big effect, not just by itself, but also as interconnected with the East African countries, the rest of Africa, the rest of the world. So it's an area we cannot ignore, it's an area we must keep investing, it's an area we must keep on improving.
All right. Professor Iraqi, I want you to hold on. When we come back, we'll get more into the debt conversation and then bring up the word that many do not like to talk about, subsidy. There is a conversation as your reaction tells it all. There is a conversation being had around the issue of subsidies as well in Kenya and Nigeria, across the continent, and how it can play into a country's economic health. You're watching Business Edge, and today we're looking at how Kenya is engaging the World Bank for a new $200 million facility, a loan to be targeted at its agricultural sector. But Kenya also has massive debt and has subsidies that could be directed in different places. We'll get into that part of the conversation after this. My guest is Professor XN Iraqi, and we're looking at how Kenya is in talks with the World Bank for a new $200 million facility that's going to be targeted at the country's agricultural sector. Prof, let me bring you back here. Now, Kenya's debt profile is estimated at about 7 trillion shillings, and that's about $60 billion. It may not be a lot in terms of how much debt the U.S. holds, but for a country such as Kenya, that's classified as a lower middle income country, it's the largest economy in East Africa, it's a problem. And as you said, there have been conversations in the past 1-2 years, even before COVID, about the debt problem. And we remember talking about when Kenyans launched an online campaign that the World Bank and the IMF should not loan Kenya any more money. We also had the Kenya and IMF conversation in which they asked the government to freeze civil service salaries, to freeze increases and things like that, to remove subsidies and all that. But let's talk about the debt now. In terms of targeting some of these initiatives towards the agricultural sector, is borrowing the best way to handle the problem? Is it the only way? Is it a combination of things that Kenya should be looking at, considering the debt that the country holds?
I think that's a very politically sensitive question, because if you in the government, you have two major sources of revenue. You can borrow or you can raise taxes. If you raise taxes, the voters are not going to be very happy. So if you're a good policy maker, if you're a good politician, you'd probably avoid raising taxes as much as possible and probably focus on borrowing, which is much easier. And you can always leave that problem to the next reader or the next generation, because borrowing can be long term. But the taxes affect people immediately, and that's not very palatable from a political perspective. But that way we can reduce that problem. We can reduce the waste. People talk about corruption in Nigeria, they talk about corruption in Kenya. So if we can reduce corruption, if we can reduce nepotism and other waste in government, you can have more money left for other services, for agriculture, for food, for education, for health, and so on. So borrowing is not the only way you can support government services, but it happens to be the easiest way.
Is it the easiest way for governments? As you said, it's easy to take on borrowing and sort of kick the bucket down the road for the next administration or the next government to have to deal with. So is it the easiest way governments are using, particularly African governments, to deal with issues now, but the problem remains for someone else to clean up?
The problem remains, the problem is postponed, but a time is coming when we must face the reality, the moment of truth. That's why I'm saying we need to move away from debt and focus on other methods, like raising taxes, expanding businesses, having more trade, reducing the waste, so that we don't depend too much on debt. It is the easiest solution, but not the best.
All right, let's look at subsidies now. This year alone, Kenya is projected to have, or rather spend about $950 million on various non-agricultural subsidies. And there's a conversation also around the subsidies. As you mentioned, taxes, people will kick against the removal of subsidies on things like petrol, maybe even electricity and things like that. If removed, this is money that could be funneled into other places. So what's the conversation happening around non-agricultural subsidies in Kenya?
I think subsidies is not just a central issue in Kenya, it's a global issue. If you go to the European Union, if you go to the US, they subsidize their farmers. And I'm sure a lot of other governments around the world subsidize their farmers for some key industries. And as an economist, that distorts the market. But from a political angle, you always have subsidies. Because if you don't subsidize the farmers, they don't produce enough food, then you have people who are angry, and that can cause some political problems. If you want your country to become a leading exporter of goods and services, sometimes it is good to subsidize those products or those services before they become mature enough to compete with the rest of the world. So I see subsidies remaining for some time. In Kenya, for example, we probably have subsidies in areas like power. We used to have subsidies in petroleum, and the price went up. So subsidies do not make economic sense, but they make a lot of political sense.
Political sense. And we're going to have one political economic question for you before we wrap things up. So as we talked about earlier, Kenya does have debts. And like many other African countries, the conversation is on about debt relief versus debt suspension and moving that bucket down the road. With a new $200 million facility now, it has renewed the conversation around whether or not Kenya should seek for debt relief. Where does Kenya stand right now when it comes to this conversation with its creditors, both the multilateral ones, the foreign ones such as China, the Paris Club? What's the conversation happening in regards to that?
Some time ago, the government of Kenya set a debt ceiling of 9 trillion Kenyan shillings. And it seems that by the end of this year, we are going to reach that. And there has been a big debate in the parliament whether we need to extend the debt ceiling to something like 12 trillion Kenyan shillings. So debt is a very big issue, and I can assure you the next president will have to face that question. What do you do with the debt? Yet you need to give services, you need to give goods to the Kenyan public. So the starting point would be, can we reschedule some of those debts with our multilateral lenders, either the Western countries or China, which has been lending Kenya some money recently? But I think the ultimate solution to that problem is for us to start living within our means. Is for us to start expanding our economy so that we get more tax revenues, for us to start reducing our waste and corruption and so on, so that we live within our means. Debt will always be there if it is put in the right use. And debt will always be there if people borrow money to put it into productive capacity of the economy. But it is always a big question in most African countries, most African governments, whether that debt is put to the right use. And if it was, I think we would be complaining less.
So what does that look like? If there is a conversation now for Kenya's debt ceiling to be increased to above 10 trillion, maybe 11, 12 trillion as it may be, what would be the knockdown effect you think would happen for the economy, for the country to be able to borrow so much more and have that gap? And unfortunately, once that is there, you're going to find government rushing to hit that ceiling once again.
Economists always talk about the crowding effect. So if the government borrows money, the private sector is denying money. And sometimes the private sector is more efficient, it's sometimes more productive than the public sector. So once the government borrows so much money, because some of that money is borrowed internally, then you deny the private sector a lot of money, and that can slow down the effect. That is why we need the government to have alternative sources of revenue, such as tax and reducing waste.
All right, so we started this conversation with the World Bank and Kenya be in talks for a $200 million facility. We should expect a decision in the next 2 months. And the time is going now for the Kenyatta administration. That ends in August. How would you rate the administration in terms of combating the agricultural issues that the country has been facing and working towards providing food security for Kenyans?
I think I would give the government a passing grade if I can become academic, because the government of President Uhuru Kenyatta had 4 key sectors that it has focused on, the so-called Big Four, and one of them has been food security. So a lot of efforts have been put in making sure that the country is food secure. He may not meet all the targets in his term, but I think the next president will have to carry on from where he stops or where he stopped. Because food security is an issue to the current presidency, will be an issue to the coming president, and will always be an issue in future. But that's an issue you cannot run away from, not just in Kenya, but in all African and all our countries in the world. Food is very important, not just for national security, but for the health and productive capacity of the citizens.
Very true. Do you, for any reason, think the World Bank would say no to this request, or is it almost a done deal?
I think that's a good question. My hunch tells me that the World Bank will say yes because of political reasons, and also because the World Bank has always been in very good terms with the government of Kenya. And I think since that money will probably attract some interest in future, the World Bank might say yes and let the government.
Okay. Well, we wanted to see how that plays out because it's one more thing, unfortunately, that may add to the country's debt, but is intended to help Kenya in the long run. Professor Xen Iraki, as always, thank you and enjoy your warm and sunny afternoon in Nairobi.
Same to you and have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much. And we'll be watching things very closely. East Africa's largest economy is not the only one that has suffered the effects of a devastating drought and a locust invasion that was now combined with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic to hit the agricultural sector and the economy overall. Now, Kenya is asking for this loan, $200 million, but my guest has said it's not enough, but many would say it is a beginning to help the agricultural sector. You're watching Business Edge. When we come back, NC4 to watch is where we are. And these are a few stories that we're keeping our eyes on with NC4 to watch. So let's kick it off. A new study has shown that China's development banks have provided $23 billion in financing for infrastructure projects in sub-Saharan Africa from 2007 to 2020. This more than doubles the amount lent by such banks from the United States, Germany, Japan, and France combined. Somaliland has huge investment potential in untapped oil and gas reserves, the foreign minister of Somalia's breakaway region told Taiwan's president Tsai Ing-wen on Wednesday, pitching investment opportunities on a high-profile visit. The meeting between the Taiwanese president and the Somaliland foreign minister Ese Ked gave an opportunity for the country to say they welcomed giant Taiwanese companies to come invest and trade with them. Uganda's fintech startup ChapChap has secured an undisclosed funding round seeking to accelerate its commercial growth and social impact creation. Investors took part in the funding round were Nordic impact funds who are aiming to help the startup scale its solution beyond Uganda. ChapChap aims to empower small and medium-sized enterprises by giving them access to digital financial tools and resources to help them scale. Egypt's investment app Thunder has raised $20 million in its Series A funding round, seeking to democratize investment in the Middle East and North Africa. This round brings the startup's funding to a total of $22 million to date. Launched in late 2020, the app makes it easier to open and manage investment accounts. Currently, users do not have access to U.S. stocks. They can only use the platform to invest in the Egyptian stock market and mutual funds. And that's the show for today. Follow us on social media, download our mobile app, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and of course, watch us on available platforms all over the world. My name is Solulokwe Adelaru Balogun. Have a fantastic day.